buzzing through the walls, making their honey and singing their song. They say I work for the queen all day. Yeah, I work for the queen all day. Yeah.
Hello, the hive, the queen bee's hive, that is. And we are back with part 2 of chapter 8, Visitations. And this second half of Visitations, for sure, makes this a 5 plus 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 honeypot chapter for me. Oh my God, it was so good. Let me say first, for those of you that don't know, which most of you do know, one of my favorite relationship arcs is Jamie and Roger's relationship. I loved this first big emotional conversation between Jamie and Roger. I was waiting for this. This, something more than that little bit of exchange that they had at the fire. And here we have it in spades. I kind of wish this was its own chapter. I wish she would have cut this in half, but she didn't. But I did. I revamped things, but no, I didn't do it on purpose. It just worked out that I needed the extra space. So we switched into Roger's POV, and if you recall where the other part left off, and by the way, this is the second half of the chapter. So if you have not watched part 1 of chapter 8, make sure you watch that first. There's also some extra material down in the bottom of that post on Benjamin Cleveland, so take a look at that. But this is the second half of that chapter. And we left off with Jamie perturbed by his conversation with Benjamin Cleveland. So we left off with him going to dig the privy to try to work off some of his, irritation, and to kind of think through things that he just had a conversation with him about. So he's back there digging. And we switched into Roger's POV for the beginning of this. And he, knowing Jenny is now coming for dinner, and he knows that like the shit might hit the fan here, and also he's feeling a sense of unease about Jamie's reaction to his choices and his experiences in 1739. He wants to put all of his cards on the table with Jamie and let him know everything. He won't feel comfortable kind of being there with him until he knows like he has put all of the information out and he knows what he did. Also, he needs to like let him know, hey, I met Jenny like a few months ago and she was 40 years younger and I don't know how that's going to fly. And did you even tell her about, he doesn't even know for sure if Jenny knows everything. He doesn't really know all that. So he waits a bit after Jamie disappears. He thinks he's taking a pee, and then when he doesn't come back, it says he follows his father-in-law into the gloaming. And I love the tone of that. It makes it sound very surreal, which is very apropos for what transpires, in this conversation. And he goes there because he wants to catch a private moment with Jamie without all the kids, where they can actually have a man-to-man conversation. And he finds Jamie contemplating a giant hole in the ground. And my mind goes right to when Jamie came up on Roger digging the big kiln, if you remember, for Brianna. And then he ended up jumping in and helping him finish it off. So I kind of love, like, it gives you like an echo of that. New privy, he asked, nodding into the pit. Jamie looked up, smiling at the sight of him, and Roger felt a rush of warmth on more than one account. On more than one account because he felt a rush of warmth of being happy, but he also felt a rush of warmth because he's nervous. Like, I better, is he going to be able to still smile at me with that warmth when he finds out what I did? So, continuing. I'd only meant it to be the usual Ken with a single seed of ease. Jamie gestured at the hole, the last of the sun touching his hair and skin with a golden light. But with 4 more, and maybe yet more in time? As you say, you mean to stay, I mean. He glanced sideways at Roger and the smile came again. Oh my God! I love it so much. Jamie is so happy to have Roger there, especially now with all of this turmoil and personality conflicts and all of this that's going on that he's just been exposed to, that's bubbling out there. It must be such a blessing to Jamie, and to his heart, to have Roger's knowledge and special giftedness with people, that he has, his ability to kind of smooth waters that are rough, that Roger has. That's a special gift for Jamie. On top of just the love Roger and his family and his daughter and his grandchildren and all of that, Roger is an asset to Jamie. And we really get that in this scene, in this first little part of the scene. And Roger, seeing his joy at seeing him, is so touched. And yet he's also internally struggling, knowing the things he has to say. Will Jamie feel the same after he says what he has to say? Will he feel that he made the right choices? And we get another mention from Jamie about a future baby. So, like, it's been now a few times that we've heard this. So now I'm kind of getting the idea we're going to see a baby in this book somewhere, somehow, or at least in a baby. In, I don't know if like the baby won't survive or something like that, but there's going to be a pregnancy and a baby somehow, that happens, I think, in this book. Then we get this really cute little problem solving reconnection scene of Roger and Jamie, with this whole privy thing. That the people come and see Claire. Roger says, I see, so you need to make it bigger. Jamie says, yeah, but it's not that simple. It's the women. Roger says, thinking that privacy is the issue, he says, oh, we'll just put it on the latch. Jamie says, yeah, I thought of that, but it's not just that. It's the germs, especially with the sick people coming to see Claire. So I'm picking up in the actual dialogue now. Roger says, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You mean the sick folk who come? They might leave. And he waved his hand toward the hole. Aye, you should have seen the carry on when Claire insisted on scalding Amy's privy with boiling water and lye soap and pouring turpentine into it after the Crombie lad left. And his shoulders rose up toward his ears, remembering, if she was to do that every time we had sick folk in our privy, we'd all be shitting in the woods too. He laughed, though, and so did Roger. Both, then, Roger said, 2 holes for the family and a separate privy for visitors, or rather, for the surgery. Say it's for convenience. You didn't want to seem highfalutin by not letting people use your own privy. No, that wouldn't do at all. Jamie vibrated briefly, then still, but stayed a moment looking down, a half smile still on his face. The smells of damp, fresh dug earth and newly sawn wood rose thick around them, mingling with the scent of the fire, and Roger could almost imagine that he felt the house solidifying out of the smoke. Jamie left off what he was thinking then, and turned his head to look at Roger. I missed you, Roger Mac, he said. Oh, my God. Roger opened his mouth to reply, but his throat had closed as hard as if he had swallowed a rock, and nothing came out but a muffled grunt. Jamie smiled and touched his arm, urging him toward a big stone that what Roger assumed would be the front of the house. Oh my God, I love this so much. I have missed Roger and Jamie so much because, like, they haven't been together for 2 books, We've had no Roger and Jamie except, like, through ghosts and feeling his presence around him, and he was walking around Lollybrock, but no actual real conversations like this. And I've missed it. And this little part with the privy, even though it's probably the least critical conversation or consequential part of this chapter, it was the part that really hit me the most. Maybe it was because it was the first little conversation. But Roger is so moved that he can't even speak. You could see, like, Jamie felt like, this is what I needed. I needed somebody that I could bounce these off and would just come up with a solution like that. And then add that little way, that little PR thing, like, okay, you don't want to have this image. You want to make sure people aren't offended with that. Like, he thinks of these things for Jamie. Jamie just thinks get the job done, but a lot of time, and Roger is the one that knows the way people are going to perceive things. Like, he's the PR guy. He's like the consigliere. And Jamie has missed that. And he's just smiles to himself. It's like, I missed you, Roger Mack. It was just so good. It's so good. And when I read this, I like had to pause and just sit there and smile to myself and be like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so glad we have Roger and Jamie back together. So I'm excited about all of the great moments between Roger and Jamie to come. So Roger observes how big this house is going to be, that it's even going to be bigger than the old big house. And Jamie asks him to walk the foundation with him. Like, let's take a walk and talk. Roger saw the big stone for the front of the house had Fraser 1779 engraved on it. And he's instantly reminded of Lollybrock. And he mentions it to Jamie. His father had done the same thing as soon as he was able to speak, and confirms it was still standing. And then he says, the last time he saw it. And then he stumbles, realizing when that was. And Jamie picks up on it, that the little stumble. And we get this exchange. Brianna told me about the men who came. He glanced back briefly at Roger, his face careful. You were gone then, of course, looking for Jem. Yes. And then he thinks, and Bree had been forced to leave the house, their house, abandoned to the hands of thieves and kidnappers. It felt like the rock had dropped from his throat into his chest. No use thinking of that just now, though, and he shoved the vision of people shooting at his wife and children down into the bottom of his brain for the moment. So that little exchange, I pick up there a little sense from Jamie that he's a little bit perturbed, tiny bit, He understands, but he's a little perturbed a tiny bit that Roger wasn't there. That these men came and shot at his daughter and his grandchildren, and Roger was not there. There was nobody to protect them, And he gets it, like he understands that Roger was trying, he was in a tough situation. But I think it kind of bugs Jamie a little bit when he's just trying to get Roger's take on the whole thing. And you can see that it seriously must eat at Roger's soul, even just bringing this up. These people came and shot at his family and he wasn't there. I really hope, please God, I hope they get a chance to kick someone's ass, whoever the hell is this person that follows them, whether it's Callahan or somebody else. I mean, I'm thinking Callahan, but it could be the unidentified person, but somebody apparently follows them. I hope we get a Jamie and Roger ass kicking of this person. So he tells Jamie that the last time he saw Lollybrock was an earlier time. Jamie paused, one eyebrow raised, and Roger cleared his throat. It was what he'd come back here to say, and there's no better time to say it. When I went to find Jem, I started by going to Lollybrock. He knew Lollybrock, and it was his home. I thought if he somehow got away from Cameron, he'd maybe go there. Jamie looked at him for a moment and then drew breath and nodded. The last said 1739. Roger replies, you would have been 18, away at university in Paris. Your family was very proud of you, Roger added softly. Jamie turned his head sharply away, stood quite still. Roger could hear the catch in his breath. Jenny, he said. You met Jenny, then. I did. She was maybe 20, then. And then, for him, was less than a year in the past. And Jenny was now what, 60? I thought I should maybe say something to you before I met her again. Jamie says, in case the shock of it knocked her over? Yeah, something like that. Jamie turned back to him now, his expression wavering between a smile and considerable shock of his own. Roger thought. Roger could feel it, the sense of disbelief, disorientation, not knowing where to put your feet down. Jamie shook his head like a bull trying to dislodge a fly. I know the feeling, mate. All of them. That's very thoughtful of ye. And then looked up. The next thought penetrating the shock and renewing it. My father. You said my family. His voice died. Oh. He was there, Roger said. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine how Jamie must feel in this conversation? Like, totally gobsmacked. But the bigger shock is yet to come. You know, he has no clue the bigger shock is yet to come. They can hear noises of the kids and people. So Roger, knowing what he still has to say, will require some private space for Jamie. Very considerate of Roger. Says, let's go somewhere more private. And they head off to the spring house. And Roger notes to Jamie that the willows in the water remind him of young women washing their hair. And Jamie smiled briefly, but his mind was not on poetry. And I love this little bit of symbolism, which is a really big key to this conversation, before this conversation, both because of the symbolism of willows themselves and the location of this conversation happening by the water. Which is an indication of things. We've talked about this before on the Beehive on Outlander Cast, how water-related plants, water-related animals, and if you're talking near the water, all of that type of imagery is an indication of things lying under the surface and deeper in the subconscious. And so I'll get more into that aspect of this conversation when we do our big study after season 6, that we're going to do on Outlander Cast. But for right now, put a pin in it. But we will explore that more. So they sit down by this water. We'll see anyone coming, Jamie said. So then, you have a thing or two to tell me. So then, Roger sat down in a patch of shade, took off his shoes and stockings, and let his legs dangle in the cool draft at the edge of the shelf, in hopes that it would slow his heart. There was no way to begin except to start. As I said, I went to Lollybrock in search of Jem, and of course he wasn't there. But Brian, your father, I ken his name, Jamie said dryly. Ever call him by it? Roger said on impulse. No, Jamie said surprised. Do men call their fathers by their Christian names in your time? No. Roger made a brief dismissive motion. I shouldn't have said it. It was part of my story, not yours. Jamie glanced at the fading sky. It's a good while till supper, he said. We've likely time for both. It's a tale for another time, Roger said, shrugging, but the meat of it is that when I came in search of Jem, I found, my father instead. His name was Jeremiah, too. Folk called him Jerry. Jamie said something in the Gaelic and crossed himself. Aye, Roger said briefly. As I said, another time. The thing was, when I found him, he was only 22. I was the age I am now. I could have been his father, or just. So I called him Jerry, thought of him that way. At the same time, he was my, I couldn't tell him who I was. There wasn't time. So we saw this in a daily line, but seeing it here in context, I really love that Roger kind of shared this before laying all of this on Jamie, because it lets Jamie know, like, hey man, I know this is weird for you, me telling you about meeting your dead father before he died, when I was like, I realize all this is strange, but I went through a very similar shock myself with my own father, It kind of unites them in a way. It kind of puts them a little more on a level playing field, so that Jamie and what he's about to hear doesn't feel like he's the only one that experienced craziness in this. You know what I mean? Like Roger went through something similar with this whole father-son thing as well, So I kind of like that. So back into our conversation. Well, so it was before that I met your father at Lollybrock. I nearly fell over with the shock when he opened the door and told me his name. He smiled a little at the memory, rueful. He was about my own age, maybe a few years older. We met as men, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Fraser. Jamie gave a brief nod, his eyes curious. Then your sister came in. And they made me welcome, fed me. I told your father, well, not the whole of it, obviously, but that I was looking for my wee lad who had been kidnapped. Brian had given Roger a bed, then taken him the next morning to all the crofts nearby, asking after Jem and Rob Cameron without result. But the next day he'd suggested riding all the way to Fort William to make inquiries at the army garrison. He could feel Jamie listening. His father-in-law didn't move. Stop it, Cat. His father-in-law didn't move at all, but Roger felt the slight tension in him at the mention of Fort William. Or maybe it's my own, Roger thought. He thrust his fingers into the cool, wet moss, trying to anchor himself. Maybe. Wow. I mean, it's like as soon as he even just mentions that he went to the garrison of Fort William, Jamie starts to get tense, and he doesn't even have the half of it yet. And so right away, Roger's feeling like, oh God, what is he going to say when I give him all of this? Okay, I got to move this cat because she, come here, keep moving my screen. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so, say hi to the audience, Puff. Say hi, Puff. So, the commander was an officer named Bunkum. Your father called him a decent fellow for Sassenach, and he was. Brian had bought 2 bottles of whiskey. Good stuff, he added, glancing at Jamie, and saw the flicker of a returned smile at that. We drank with Bunkum, and he promised to have his soldiers make inquiries. That made me feel hopeful, as though I might really have some chance of finding Jem. He hesitated for a moment, trying to think how to say what he wanted to, but after all, Jamie had known Brian himself. It wasn't so much Bunkum's courtesy, it was Brian Dew, he said, looking straight at Jamie. He was kind, very kind, but it was more than that. He had a vivid memory of it, Brian riding up in front of him on a hill, bonnet and broad shoulders, dark with rain, back straight and sure. I felt, as though if this man was on my side, then things would be all right. Everyone felt that about him, Jamie said softly, looking down. Roger nodded, silent. Jamie's auburn head was bent, his gaze fixed on his knees, but Roger saw that head turn a fraction of an inch and tilt as though in answer to a touch, and a tiny ripple of something between awe and simple acknowledgment stirred the hairs on his own scalp. There it is, he thought, at once surprised and not surprised at all. He'd seen it, or rather felt it before, but it had taken several repetitions before he realized fully what it was. The summoning of the dead, when those who loved them spoke of them. He could feel Brian Dew here beside this mountain creek, as surely as he had felt him on that dreek day in the Highlands. Roger gave a brief nod to the ghost who stood with them and thought, forgive me, and went on. Oh, my God, my heart. A couple thoughts on this. First, again, I really think this points up to Roger's Mac Mojo and the connection of that Mac Mojo with Jamie, who also has it. Also, it points to Roger's empathic nature. He's so tuned in, both spiritually and emotionally, to everything. And Jamie, can you imagine Jamie hearing all this? I mean, he just wanted to dig a privy and soothe his mind from this Cleveland conversation. And now he's getting this onslaught of stuff, of all of this emotional stuff. And we hear later in his convo with Jenny that, this must be so strange for him to hear Roger speak in the zone of just having these conversations with a father that has been going to him for 40 years, noting the good stuff, that about the liquor, noting the manner that he had. It brings all of these like long ago memories to the forefront, and all of these memories come flooding back because he's talking about them like they happened yesterday, you know? So it had to just be like seriously surreal for Jamie. Then Roger tells Jamie about Buck's role and how that they, all about Buck and how they ran into Dougal while collecting the rents. Holy moly. Like, Jamie has to be completely freaking out, Now we get the whole, we ran into Dougal and here they were together, his son and his, just the fact that he ran into Dougal. Jesus, Jamie said, though Roger noticed he didn't cross himself at the mention of Dougal. His mouth curved up at the corner. Did Dougal ken that this man, Buck, was his son? No, Roger said dryly, as Buck hadn't been born yet. Buck Kent Dougal was his father, though, and that was a bit of a shock for him. Not only for him. I imagine it would be, Jamie murmured. A tinge of amusement lingered on his face, and Roger wondered, not for the first time, at the ability of Highlanders to step back and forth between this world and the next. Jamie had killed his uncle when he had to, but had made his peace post-mortem, and he'd heard Jamie call on Dougal for help in battle, and he'd seen him get it too. Roger and Buck had got it as well. Dougal had lent them horses for their journey. But as Roger said, this wasn't about his own search for his son and father. This was about what he owed to another father and another son, to the shade of Brian Dew and to Jamie. Ah, I love the poetry of that. Don't you love the poetry of that? So in this whole conversation, if you notice, we are getting another recap, but this is one that we wanted. So we can kind of let this one slide, but it just feels like I said, there's so much of this recapping. And I guess you had to when you're having a reuniting of characters, but it's a lot. You kind of feel like the entire first section is a lot of recapping. So far, anyway. So Roger gets back on topic saying that they went back to Lollybrock because Brian sent word that he had something that may have to do with his son. And then he tells him about the discs that were sent by the garrison commander at Fort William with the Mackenzie and the numbers on them, Jerry's dog tags. And then, as if Jamie has not been hit with enough today, he gets a major shock and blow. Poor Jamie, I felt so bad for him and for Roger when he realizes that Jamie did not know that he knew. So I have to read this part. We needed to find where those tags came from, So we went back to Fort William, and he had to stop and breathe to get it out. Captain Bunkum had left. The new garrison commander was a Captain Randall. All amusement had vanished from Jamie's face, which was now blank as a slate. Aye, Roger said and coughed a bit. Him. The new commander had been cordial, personable, helpful, Roger said. It was... He searched for a word and then spread his hands, helpless to find it. It was weird. I mean, I knew what he'd... And he stopped. Done to me? Jamie's eyes were fixed on his, unreadable. What he'd do to you, Claire told us, when she... And he caught Jamie's face and hurried on. I mean, she kent you were dead, or I'm sure she wouldn't have. She told you everything then. Jamie's expression hadn't changed much, but his face had gone pale. Oh, shit, Roger thought. Well, just the general outline, and then he stopped. You'll never make a decent minister if you can't be honest. Buck had said that to him, and he was right. Roger took a breath. Yes, he said simply, and felt his innards hollow out. Without a word, Jamie got to his feet, turning away, took several steps into the bushes, stopped, and threw up. Oh, Jesus. Oh, God. What was I thinking? Roger felt as though he'd been holding his breath for an hour and took a sip of air and then another. He'd been thinking so far ahead to what he needed to say to Jamie, to explain, to apologize, to ask for forgiveness. He needed to do that if he and Bree were to live here again. But he hadn't thought at all that Jamie might not realize that Roger, and Bree for God's sake, knew the intimate details of his personal Gethsemane and had known them for years. Bloody, bloody, bloody. Oh, hell. Roger sat with his fists clenched, listening to Jamie gulp air, spit, and pant. He kept his eyes fixed on a scarlet ladybug with black spots that had lighted on his knee. Oh, my God, my God, oh, my God. I mean, that's the thing. And it never really connected to me that Jamie didn't know the impact of knowing Roger knew all these details. I love that line where he says, knew the intimate details of his personal Gethsemane and had known them for years. First, Gethsemane is so evocative, and it goes along with the whole messianic symbolism of that entire storyline, that had happened. But we know that he knew Bree knew the general information because she told him in their discussion about Bonnet's rape. But he never knew that Roger was there too and knew it all. And it's that last part where he says, had known those details for years. For years. It's hitting Jamie, especially someone so connected to his male leadership role and his pride and his father role to Roger, that Roger has known this from the moment they met. From the moment he beat the crap out of him on that, that day at Fraser's Ridge, all this time, all of these different machinations of their relationship and the entire arc of their relationship, Roger, without him knowing, knew everything. His personal hell, his personal biggest secret, his biggest horror. Roger knew that entire time and had all this interaction with him, having no idea that he had that knowledge and that filter in place. So it's just this wow moment. And poor Roger, he was so focused on breaking the news that he could have killed Randall and didn't. He didn't even think this would be the real shock, So now he's got to give him this other shock, on top of that, after just watching him throw up and gasp for air and everything else. So Jamie finally comes back and Roger goes to say something. And Jamie chops his hand and says, don't. So wow, So after a few minutes, the conversation continues. And Jamie sighed, gave Roger a very direct look. Go on then, he said, tell me the rest. Roger nodded and met Jamie's eyes. I knew about Randall and what he was, he said bluntly, and what would happen, not just to you, to your sister and to your father. This time Jamie did cross himself slowly and whispered something in Gaelic that Roger didn't catch, but didn't ask to have it repeated. I told Buck then, just about the flogging, not about, and the fingers of Jamie's hand flickered as though he was about to make a chopping motion again. Roger said about your father and what happened to him then. And he felt again the cold horror of that conversation. If he did nothing to stop Jack Randall, Brian Dew Fraser would be dead within a year. Dead of an apoplexy suffered while watching his son being flogged to death, or so he thought, by a Captain Randall. Jamie would be outlawed, wounded in body and soul, bearing the guilt of knowing his father's death lay upon him, knowing that he had abandoned his home and tenants to his bereaved and shattered sister, and Jenny, that lovely young girl, left completely alone, without even a brother's protection. Jamie didn't flinch at the telling, but Roger could feel the words go into his flesh like darts. Jenny, Christ, how will I face her? I mean, this chapter is just so stunning. I mean, it's just stunning. And this one and the last one were very heavy chapters. Poor Roger is so worried that they both will resent him. And I like this next bit. He drew a deep breath. They were nearly there. Buck wanted to kill him, Randall, right away, without hesitation. There was the barest breath of a laugh in Jamie's voice, though it wavered a bit. He was Dougal's son, then. Oh, absolutely, no doubt about it, Roger assured him. You should have seen the two of them together. I wish I had. And so I kind of love that. And you know that I think he really does wish that, He would love to see Dougal again. Dougal gone, who was gone by his own hand for a very long time, again being spoken of as if this was yesterday. Okay? So it's going to be like surreal for Jamie to hear all this. And so in this next bit, we find another boo-boo made by Diana or whoever. And it's a somewhat unforgivable one, I think, since this was said, the opposite of this was said just a couple pages before in this same chapter, that Bunkum was there. He was a decent fellow for a Sassenach, and he was there when he went with his dad before. It was not Randall there. So someone should have caught this on an edit, but I digress. Roger rubbed a hand over his face, shaking his head. The thing is, we could have stopped him, killed him, I mean. We were armed. I have been to see him before with your dad. He'd have no fear of me. I could have gone to his office with Buck and done it, or we might have followed him to his lodgings and done it there. We'd have a good chance of getting away. Jamie had flinched just once at the word da. He sat quietly now, though, his eyes the only thing alive in his face. I wouldn't let Buck do it, Roger blurted, speaking to those eyes. I knew it would happen, all of it, and I let it happen. To your family, to you. Great courage there by Roger. Here, Roger could have never said anything about that. He could have just left it that he met Jenny, and that was it. But he wanted to put all his cards on the table, and I got to really respect Roger's courage in that. It showed a lot of courage in him to do that, because he didn't have to. Jamie looked down, but didn't speak. Roger felt fresh air from the creek come up from below, and felt the cold shadow of the trees touch his burning face. At last Jamie stirred, nodding his head once, then twice, deciding. And if you killed him, he said quietly, if I hadn't been an outlaw, I'd not have been near Craignadoon, and in bad need of a healer on that day when... And he looked at him, and Roger nodded, wordless. Brianna, Jamie said softly, her name the sound of a cool breeze in the Gaelic. Would she have happened? And the bairns? You, for that matter? We might still have happened, Roger said, and swallowed. Another way. But I was scared it might not. But I'm not... He bit that off. Jamie knew he wasn't trying to make excuses. Well... Jamie got to his feet, scattering a cloud of gnats like a shower of gold dust in the evening night. Did a fash then. I will not let Jenny kill ye. Come on then, supper will be burnt. Roger felt rather as though a rug had been pulled out from under him. He didn't know what he'd been expecting, but apparent calm acceptance, wasn't it? You don't, he began hesitantly. I don't. Jamie reached down a hand, and when Roger took it, hauled him to his feet, so they stood face to face, the trees beginning to rustle around them in the evening breeze. This is important. I spent a great deal of time thinking, Ken, Jamie said conversationally, tilting his head toward the creek. When I lived as an outlaw, after Culloden, out under the sky, listening to the voices you hear in the wind, and I would look back, wondering at the things I'd done and not done, and thinking, what if I'd done it differently? If we'd not chosen to try to stop Charles Stewart, it would have been different for us, at least, if not for the Highlands. I maybe have kept Claire by me. If I'd not gone back to fight Jack Randall and the Boy de Boulogne, would I have 2 daughters now instead of 1? He shook his head, the lines in his face deep, and his eyes dark with shadows. This is so important, and it's something I always try to impress to people who take issue with the events of Dragonfly and Amber, and early Voyager, or who don't see the point, etc., etc. I have even had this conversation with Blake because it's not really obvious to a lot of people. So I'm so glad that Diana wrote this in Jamie's mindset here. There's something underlying those events that has haunted Jamie and Claire for years. And it's why now they never try to change history again. They only try to survive what they know is coming. It's a different thing to just survive what you know is coming and skate around it, or trying to actually change written history. They learned in Dragonfly and Amber that all their efforts to change history actually contributed to bringing it to pass. Had they not spent so much time in Paris, frustrating money and efforts, would Bounty Prince Charlie have gone into this more funded and supported from the start? Did their interventions cause them to get the needed support too late? Is that why history happened as it did? Because history included their efforts to start with? Does the fall of Scotland fall on their shoulders because of their manipulations? Jamie Claire will never know the answer to that. And that crushes them and haunts them, especially Jamie. So ever since then, it's something like that was the importance of Dragonfly and Amber. That was the importance of all that happened in that book, because it taught them this important lesson of all of the stuff they lost because of their efforts to try to change history. And they learned, never, ever since then, they will never do that again. They will never try to do that again. They look at the historical record as a helpful guide for their actions regarding their own family, and to help them survive whatever they know is going to happen. But they never again try to wholesale change big historical happenings, good or bad, because they never want to wonder if it was their fault. Jamie knows Roger's temptation and fear here. He knows how his compassionate heart would want to intervene, and he understands the internal battle that Roger had. And the bottom line is that he too would never give up all that he suffered, including the loss of his father, if it meant no Claire, no Bree, no Mandy, no Jem, or even Fergus and all the other people he loved, which all resulted from that. And Fraser's Ridge. So then we get this fantastic quote that's so profound. He says, "No man owns his own life. Part of you is always in someone else's hands. All you can do is hope it's mostly God's hands that you're in." He touched Roger's shoulder, nodding toward the trail. "We should go." Roger followed, eased in mind, but unable to see the grubby coarse shirt that covered Jamie's back without still seeing all the scars beneath. It's just so freaking good. I love that quote from Jamie. It's very profound. So now we switch into Jamie's POV. So when he gets back, we see Jamie really embrace the joy of his family and his home in this really cute way. And it's almost as like he knows it could have easily been different. It's like he has a new appreciation almost. And so he gets Fanny and Mandy to come with him to sneak a whiff of the pot. And then Bree comes in and they have this banter about what he's doing. And now he's looking out for Jenny, wanting to talk to her about Roger before she sees him. And he thinks, prepare her how? He wondered. Do you mind a man who came to Lollybrock 40 years ago looking for his son? Oh, you don't? Oh, well, he's here, only... Maybe she would remember. She'd been a young lass, and Roger Mack was no bad looking. Hell no, he wasn't bad looking. And we know she was crushing on him a little wee bit, which kind of gets confirmed a little in this chapter too. And so then I digress. And from what Roger Mack had told him, Dad had spent a good bit of time in helping him search. So perhaps the realization that he thought about Dad so casually, thinking of him as still alive, made him feel as though he missed the last stair and came down staggering. So he's getting a sense of the weirdness of talking about his father like he was around a few months ago. And I love him acknowledging that Roger is a hottie So after bantering a bit with Claire, they hear Augie, and he comments, "It sounds like a catamount having the griping farts, so it's likely Augie." I love that. Augie is like the Murray version of "Hello the House." They don't need to say that because Augie, they hear Augie first. So he tells Claire that he's going out to meet them because he wants to talk to Jenny before she sees Roger, and he tells Claire to have a tram ready. So he finds Jenny sitting on a stump, shaking out a stone from her shoe, and she throws herself into Jamie's arms. "Jamie, Akustala, your bonny lass, I'm fit to burst with joy for ye." She let go of his ribs and he looked up. Her eyes were brimming with tears, and he felt his own sting too, though he couldn't help but laughing through it, her joy reminding him of his own. "Ay, me too," he said. He wiped his eyes briefly on his sleeve and set her cap straight for her. "How long ago was it that you met Brianna? She said she'd gone to Lollybrook looking for her mother and me, and you met you and Ian and all, and Leary," he added, remembering. Jenny crossed herself at the mention of the name and laughed too. Blessed mother, the look on Leary's face when she saw the lass, and the one when she tried to claim Mam's pearls, and Brianna shut her up like a writing desk. I love that description. Did she? He regretted not seeing that, but then forgot it, recalling why he came to look for Jenny. And I have to say that with all the blows that he has had today, he handled this conversation really well with Jenny. And note how Diana, again, works in more recapping here, but in a clever way to ease Jenny into the conversation. He starts right out with saying Roger's full name to kind of put it in her mind as he starts to tell her the rest of the story. "Brianna's man," he said to the top of her head as she bent to put her shoe back on. "Roger Mackenzie." "Aye, what sort of man is he then? You said you liked him fine in your letters." "Oh, I still do," he assured her. "It's just, do you recall when Claire and I came to Scotland to bury Simon the General at Balnain?" "I'm no likely to forget it," she said, her face darkening. Nor would she. That had been during Ian's long dying, a terrible time for them all, but worse by far for her. He hated to bring it back to her, even for a moment, but couldn't think how else to begin. "You'll remember then what Claire told y'all about where she came from." Jenny looked blankly at him, her mind still shadowed by the memories, but she blinked, frowning. "Aye," she said cautiously. "Some taradiddle about Stone Circle and fairies, as I recall." "Aye, yeah, that's the bit. Now, can you maybe cast your mind back a little further to the time when I was away in Paris, just before Dad died?" "I can," she said tersely, glaring up at him. "But I didn't want to. Why are you plaguing me with that, of all things?" He patted the air with his palm, urging her to hear him out. "There was a man that came to Lollybrook, looking for his kidnapped son, a dark-haired man, called Roger Mackenzie, from Lacoche," he said. "Do you remember him?" The sun was coming down, but there was plenty of light left to show him the blood draining from her face. She swallowed visibly and nodded once. Look how much Jenny remembers in this next little part. She forgets nothing, Jenny. 40 years, in the words of Elspeth Cunningham, His wee lad was named Jeremiah, she said. "I remember, because Dad got a wee bobby sent him from the garrison commander," her lips compressed, "and he kent she was thinking of Jack Randall. And when the dark-haired man came back, Dad gave it to him, and I heard Mr. Mackenzie talking to his friend later and saying that it must have belonged to his own father, who was named Jeremiah, like Jemmy. His son's name was Jeremiah, and they called him Jemmy." She stopped talking and stared at him, her eyes round as three-penny bits. "You're telling me that your grandson is that Jemmy, and the dark-haired man is—" "I am," he said, and let his breath out. She sat down again very slowly. Wow. I mean, can you imagine this conversation? What must she think? I mean, so much for calling it taradiddle. I mean, really, I mean, that thought's gone. So he lets her process it a bit, remembering all his own emotions and fear and bewilderment when Claire had laid things to him out at Cradensmere. And so he squatted down in front of her and he says, I can, he said to her, but it's no really different than if they come from Spain, maybe, or Timbuktu. She darted him a sharp glance and snorted, but her hands clenched in her lap started to relax. So the way of it is that Roger Mack and Brianna were each of them at Lollybrock then. You met Brianna when she came to find us, but you'd met Roger Mack years earlier, looking for his wee lad. Brianna came again a bit later with the bairns, looking for Roger. You didn't meet her then, but she saw Da. He paused for a moment, waiting. Jenny's look changed suddenly, and she sat up straighter. She met Da? But he was already dead. Her voice trailed off as she tried to juggle it all in her head. She did, he said, and swallowed the lump in his throat. And Roger Mack spent some time with that too, searching. He told me things about that. See, for the two of them, it was no more than a few months ago that they saw him, he said softly, and took her hand, holding it tight. To hear Roger Mack speak of him so, it's as though Da stood right beside me. She let out a small breath and a sob, and he squeezed her hand tight between her own. The tears were in her eyes again, but she wasn't afraid, and she blinked them back, sniffing. It's maybe easier if you think of it as a miracle, he said, trying to be helpful. I mean, it is, no? She gave him a look and took out a hanky and blew her nose. Don't try me, she said. Come, he said, and stood pulling her up. You've a new nephew to meet again. Ah, I love that too. Jenny's days of doubt are done now. And I really hope we get a similar moment with John in this book. So then we get, finally, the moment of truth. And we're back in Roger's POV. A lot of POV shifts in this chapter, by the way. And I just adore how totally sweet and gallant Roger is here. And it's like this little secret that they share with a smile, both remembering how they kind of each found each other attractive. It's so cute, you know. And Jenny is almost girlish again here, remembering. You can almost see like the girl in her coming back out as she sees this hunky, dark-haired stranger that she had met 40 years ago. And then he calls her Miss Fraser. I love that too. So Roger, it says Roger saw Jamie first stepping out from the shadow of the chimney, a shadow himself. We're in Roger's POV. Dark against dark, and behind him another shadow, so insubstantial that for a moment he wasn't sure she was there at all. Then he found himself on his feet, moving to meet her on the edge of the firelight. The flicker of the flames behind him bright in her eyes, and the lovely girl he had known shining out from them. Miss Fraser, he said softly, and took her hand in both of his, light-boned and firm as a bird's foot. Well met. She breathed a laugh, her lines creasing around her eyes. Last time we met, she said, I thought I'd like it if you kissed my hand. But you didn't. He could see the rapid beat of her pulse in the side of her throat, but her hand was steady in his, and he raised it and kissed it with tenderness that was not at all assumed. I thought your father might take it amiss, he said, smiling. A slightly startled expression crossed her face, and her hand tightened on his. It's true, she whispered, staring up at him. You saw Dad. Talk to him only a few months ago? Your voice doesn't sound... You didn't talk like you think he's dead. Her voice was filled with wonderment. Jamie made a soft noise deep in his throat and moved out of the shadows, touching her arm. Brianna, too, he said quietly, and tilted his head toward the fire where Roger saw Bree, holding Augie, talking to the other children, her long red hair lifting in the warm, rising air from the fire. She was waving the baby's podgy little hand in regal gestures, talking for him in a deep comic voice, and the bairns were all giggling. She saw that too. though she didn't get to speak to him. He was in the burying ground at Lollybrook, and she said he knelt by Mommy's stone, and he brought her holly and yew bound with red thread. Mommy. Jenny's voice caught in her throat with a small click, and Roger saw tears well suddenly in her eyes. He let go of her hand as Jamie put his arm around her and drew her close, and brother and sister clung together, faces hidden in each other, holding love between them. He was still staring at them when he felt Claire beside him. She was watching them as well, her face smooth and her heart in her eyes. Silently she took his hand. My heart. It was just so good. So all the feels in this chapter. So even though this didn't go down with a lot of shock and awe like we imagine, with all this big drama, of this big, like, her seeing him and being in shock, it did have so much tenderness and heart. So let me know in the comments your thoughts on this back half. Did the reveal play out the way you thought, or did it leave you wanting because you expected more drama with the revelations? And what were your thoughts on Roger and Jamie's convo and all of those revelations? Like I said, this should have been 2 chapters, but I did it for you anyway. Not intentionally, but that's how it worked out. I will be back soon with Chapter 9, Animal Nursery Tales. I'll see you then. I'll probably do Chapter 9 and 10 tomorrow together, and hopefully we will be done with Part 1 tomorrow. So until then, I'll see you. Hope you enjoyed. Bye.